Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that's, well, both ancient and really cutting edge. Is consciousness actually software?
It's a huge one.
It really is. We'll be exploring this pretty intriguing idea, mainly looking through the lens of a discussion with cognitive scientist Joscha Bach.
Right. His perspective is quite specific on this.
Yeah. And if you've ever sort of pondered the nature of your own awareness, and maybe you want a clear perspective without getting totally swamped in academic jargon, you're definitely in the right place.
We've tried to boil down the key arguments from his interview. It was on the Institute of Art and Ideas YouTube channel.
That's the one. So our mission today is really to unpack the arguments for consciousness being software, explore what that actually means, and, touch on some of the implications.
Sounds good. So where do we even start? How does someone like Bach define consciousness? It's notoriously slippery.
It really is. Well, Bach focuses on two main things. First, he calls consciousness a second-order perception.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
It means it's not just about perceiving things, seeing, hearing, feeling. It's about being aware that you are having those perceptions.
So the awareness of the seeing, not just the seeing itself.
Exactly. Think about like your visual system registering red versus you knowing you're seeing red. It's that extra layer.
Got it. And he's careful, isn't he, to separate that from metacognition?
Yeah, good point. Metacognition is more like thinking about your thoughts. Like, do I understand this?
Right. Higher level reflection.
But this second-order perception Bach talks about is more immediate. It's a direct awareness of the experience right now.
So less I'm thinking about my experience and more just I am experiencing this.
Precisely. And that leads to the second key part of his definition, the nowness.
The feeling that it's always happening in the present moment.
Yeah, that constant, undeniable feeling that consciousness creates this continuous now that we're always in.
Interesting. Immediate awareness, always present. Okay.
He also talks about consciousness maybe being an operator. What's that about?
Right. This is where his idea starts getting, well, really interesting. He suspects consciousness basically acts as a fundamental learning algorithm.
A learning algorithm, like a core strategy.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
He thinks its main job is to maximize coherence across your mind. It's always trying to build consensus between different things in your working memory.
Consensus? You mean like resolving conflicting ideas inside your head?
In a way, yeah. By pushing for consistency, trying to make more of your internal models and perceptions true, at the same time, consciousness sort of carves out this mental space that's mostly free of immediate contradictions.
So it tries to create a unified picture.
Exactly. You can hold conflicting thoughts, sure, but the conscious experience itself tends to feel unified. That's why, despite all the chaos in the brain, we feel like we have this single stream of consciousness. It's the result of this constant internal negotiation.
Okay, that makes a certain kind of sense. But what about illusions? When what we see feels like a flat-out contradiction.
That's a really good question. Bach argues our perception isn't about calculating exact probabilities. It's more about assessing possibilities quickly.
Like making fast judgments.
Yeah. Think about needing to spot a threat fast. Our perceptual system develops biases to make quick interpretations. For example, we see right angles everywhere in our built environment.
Right? Tables, buildings.
So our visual system gets biased towards seeing right angles, even if they're slightly off. Illusions, he thinks, often happen when these learned biases lead to the wrong interpretation in weird situations.
So the system makes a usually good guess, but sometimes gets it wrong.
Exactly, like with optical illusions.
Yeah.
But even in the illusion, your conscious perception is still rendering a coherent, though incorrect, picture. The feeling itself isn't contradictory, even if the content is wrong.
Okay, I see. Framing illusions as a byproduct of efficiency. Interesting. Now, switching gears a bit, Bach also talks about consciousness in animals. We often think of humans as, uniquely conscious.
Yeah, he really pushes back against that. He basically calls it human vanity to assume consciousness is the absolute pinnacle of mental development.
Why?
Well, he points out that consciousness shows up really early in humans. Infants have it before lots of their cognitive skills. And tragically, people who never develop it remain in a vegetative state. So that really suggests it's not some advanced add-on, but maybe more like a fundamental prerequisite for other mental stuff to develop.
Okay, so if it's that basic, what about other animals?
Exactly. If it's this relatively simple foundational thing that even babies have, Bach finds it, I think he said almost ridiculous, to think many animals, cats, dogs, birds, whatever, aren't also aware of their own awareness to some degree.
Based on how they act.
Yeah, anyone who's really watched animals sees complex behaviors that suggest something more than just pure instinct. Some kind of internal experience seems likely.
Okay, cats and dogs, maybe. But what about something much simpler, like insects? That feels like a much bigger jump.
It definitely is, and he acknowledges it's more speculative there. But his logic is interesting. He suggests that consciousness, if it is a simple and effective learning algorithm,
Yeah.
maybe nature stumbled upon it pretty early on. It could just be an efficient way for any self-organizing system, like a nervous system, even a simple one, to learn.
So he doesn't rule it out even for insects.
He's hesitant to draw a hard line. He admits we don't know. But the possibility is there if consciousness is fundamentally about a certain type of learning process.
Wow, okay, that's a very broad view. Now, you mentioned he's a physicalist. How does that square with consciousness being an operator or software? That sounds kind of abstract.
Yeah, his physicalism is key. He insists that any theory about reality has to mesh with the success of physics, especially the standard model.
Meaning?
Meaning everything has to follow physical laws, including information conservation. So for Bach, this rules out any non-physical mind stuff that could somehow magically influence the physical world without playing by physics rules.
Right, no ghosts in the machine.
Pretty much. Proposing that kind of thing would contradict a huge amount of science.
Okay, so if it's not magic, how does consciousness work physically? This gets us to the core idea. Consciousness as software. He said it's not just an analogy, but literally correct. That's a strong claim.
It is a strong claim. His argument is that the mind is essentially a pattern of information processing happening in the physical brain. It's a self-reinforcing causal pattern.
Okay.
And we already have a word for causal patterns that can run on different physical substrates but still have effects.
Software, like the apps on my phone.
Exactly like that. The app doesn't care about the specific brand of silicon chip it's running on, fundamentally, but it absolutely needs the physical transistors flipping on and off to actually do anything.
So the brain is the hardware, consciousness is the software pattern running on it.
That's the core idea. The hardware provides the physical mechanism. The software dictates the pattern, the computations, the behavior that emerges from that mechanism.
But wait, the software on my phone was designed by people, right? And it runs on servers somewhere. How does that compare to consciousness?
Good point. Computer software is usually engineered by us, often deterministic. Consciousness, though, seems to be self-organizing, no external programmer.
Right.
And it runs on neurons, which are living cells with their own biological, well, interests, you could say, survival function.
So the consciousness software doesn't just get loaded.
No, it has to emerge. It has to, in a sense, convince the neurons to run its pattern. This happens through learning, development, because running this consciousness program benefits the organism somehow.
So consciousness is like software that spontaneously arose and kind of took over our brains.
That's one way to put it, yeah. Bach's model sees the brain as the hardware and consciousness as this specific type of self-organizing information processing the software that runs on it.
And this creates our reality.
It creates a simulation of reality.
Right.
This emergent mind running on the neural network generates a really sophisticated internal world, almost like a game engine.
A game engine.
Yeah, it simulates sights, sounds, feelings, interactions, even your sense of being a self. And your conscious viewpoint is like the player character inside that simulation.
Whoa.
So you feel like you are that character inside the simulation, and you mistake that simulated world for fundamental reality instead of seeing it as something generated by the underlying biology.
Okay, that is deeply counterintuitive. I get why people would be skeptical. Equating my inner world with software still feels wrong somehow, not physical.
It's totally understandable. It clashes with our gut feeling. That's where Bach brings in another analogy. Money.
Money. How's that relevant?
Well, think about it. Money isn't really a physical thing, is it? A banknote is just paper or polymer. A bank balance is just data.
True.
But money is undeniably real in its effects. It shapes the entire world. It works as a causal pattern, a kind of social software rules and representations we all agree on that structures things at a certain level.
Okay, I see the parallel. An abstract pattern with real-world effects.
Exactly. And just like money can exist across different physical forms, cash, digital records, Bach argues the mind, this consciousness software, can adapt to changes in the brain hardware, like neurons dying and being replaced, without necessarily breaking the core pattern.
So, consciousness. An abstraction, but a causally effective one. Still, it feels like the most real thing there is, not an abstraction.
You've hit the nail on the head. That's the central tension. Our subjective feeling is undeniable. But Bach, coming from computer science, sees the physical universe as maybe fundamentally mathematical, and our vivid experienced world, that's the brain's simulation interpreting data.
And he thinks we can break out of this feeling of reality.
He suggests it might be possible, and maybe by deconstructing our quality of the raw feel of things like redness or pain, and even our sense of self. He links this to what people describe in mystical experiences.
Loss of self, unity.
Right. That sense of going beyond the usual boundaries of the self.
Yeah.
Beyond contradictions.
It sounds like his computer science background heavily influences this. He mentioned a disconnect with philosophy.
Yes, he sometimes expresses frustration. Coming from computation, he values precision. He feels philosophical terms about the mind can be, well, fuzzy, not clearly defined operationally.
Unlike math, which builds from clear definitions.
Exactly. He argues we need to mathematize the human mind, build precise computational models before we can really bridge the gap between philosophical ideas and testable science.
So debating if machines can understand is pointless without defining understand computationally first.
That's his stance. He finds those debates frustrating because the core terms are often, in his view, poorly defined.
Okay, which brings us back to consciousness as behavior. If it is a behavior, can we describe it with computation? Like zeros and ones, that's another sticking point for many.
Right. And Bach isn't necessarily saying consciousness is just zeros and ones in a crude way. It's more about the principle. Can we find a formal system, maybe using computational building blocks, that's powerful enough to describe any system-changing states?
Like computer science does for many complex functions.
Yeah. If consciousness is a dynamic process, a behavior, then theoretically it should be describable in such a formal language. And he does agree consciousness is a behavior we experience from the inside as what it's like to be me.
And this links to his idea of existing as if. What does he mean there?
This is maybe the most mind-bending part. He suggests that fundamentally, physically, the you that you feel like might not exist directly.
Yeah.
Instead, you exist as if you do. Your neurons are just physical things following physical laws. They don't feel anything.
Right.
But for the organism to function well, it's incredibly useful to have an internal simulation, a model of what it's like to be a feeling, experiencing organism, to feel hunger, joy, navigate the world.
So the brain creates this simulation.
Yes, a highly complex one. And the output of that simulation drives behavior. So you, you are essentially the main character inside that simulation.
Living in the brain's dream, not in fundamental physics.
That's the essence of it. You exist within the generated simulation.
So my feeling of being me, my very self, is part of the simulation, maybe even an illusion.
Exactly. Even though the feeling of consciousness seems like the most certain thing, Bach agrees with illusionism, philosophers like Keith Frankish. He sees consciousness as a construct, partly simulated.
He distinguished simulation from simulacrum.
Yeah. A simulation, like a good game, has real causal structure. You can interact within its rules. A simulacrum is more like a movie, just a surface appearance with no real interaction possible. Bach suspects our conscious experience might be a mix of both.
Okay. What does this whole picture mean for free will? That feels pretty real, too.
Bach sees free will not as a fundamental physical thing, but as a psychological phenomenon.
Psychological.
Yeah. It's the internal feeling or representation we have when we commit to an action, especially when we feel uncertain about our own future choices.
Like I feel I'm choosing because I can't perfectly predict myself.
Kind of. He uses examples. A parent might predict a child's action, but the child feels free. A magician might guide a choice, but the participant feels they chose freely. It's about the subjective experience of navigating uncertainty.
So, important psychologically, but maybe not ontologically real at the physical level?
That seems to be his view. It's a functional aspect of our psychology, not necessarily a feature of fundamental reality.
Right. This leads to one last big question. Epistemology versus ontology. It feels like my consciousness is how I know anything. How can it be secondary to math or code?
That's a very powerful intuition, isn't it? Consciousness feels like the starting point for all knowledge.
Yeah. How can I grasp math without being conscious first?
Bach gets that. But he argues that to understand how we know anything, how our minds represent the world, we need to understand representation itself. And representation, he claims, is fundamentally a mathematical or computational problem.
He also questions if our memories of conscious states are always reliable.
Exactly. Can we be absolutely certain about the nature of past conscious states? Or are memories also constructions? He wants to shift the question. Not how is consciousness fundamental, but rather, What are the necessary conditions in a physical or mathematical universe with regular laws for these kinds of representational systems, these complex behaviors, and these subjective experiences to arise at all?
Okay, so wrapping this up, it's been a pretty dense journey. We've explored Joscha Bach's argument that consciousness isn't just like software, but maybe it fundamentally is a kind of self-organizing software.
Right, software running on the brain's hardware, generating the reality we perceive.
And the implications are huge, forcing us to rethink things like the self, reality itself, even free will.
Definitely gives you a lot to chew on.
Absolutely. So, for you listening, here's a final thought. If consciousness is essentially a sophisticated simulation, what does that really mean for who you are and your place in the universe?
Could understanding this internal software lead to breakthroughs in understanding the mind, or even creating artificial intelligence?
Big questions. We hope you'll keep pondering them. Maybe even check out the full BGA interview for more nuance. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.